In 513 BC, the Persian king Darius went on a military campaign against the Scythians, which brought him across the Danube River into modern-day Romania. In crossing this river, he was supported by the Ionian tyrants of Asia, Greek-speaking city despots who ruled over their own people, having been appointed by Persian authority. These tyrants sailed to the Ister River, which is the Danube, and built a bridge for the Persian army. Having crossed it, Darius found a Scythian people who were ever in transit, moving around with all of their possessions in wagons, unwilling to engage him in battle and destroying anything that might feed his army. During these maneuvers, the Greeks waited at the bridge for the king's return. Darius was relying on them to maintain that bridge they had built in order for him to return home. But the Scythians could see that if these Greeks destroyed the bridge, that the Persians would be trapped, and so they sent messengers to the Greeks who were guarding it, propositioning them with the following words. According to Herodotus, "You could immediately tear down the bridge and depart with peace of mind. Farewell in your freedom, and be grateful to the gods and the Scythians. As for your former master," by this he meant Darius, "we will deal with him in such a way that he will never wage war against anyone again." So these Greeks have an opportunity to try to lift Persian rule from their cities by causing Darius to be trapped in Scythia and left to the mercy of a people on whom he could inflict no real damage. And so what will they do? Herodotus continues. The Ionians then conferred about how they should respond to this advice. Miltiades of Athens proposed that they obey the Scythians and thereby free Ionia. Histiaeus of Miletus was of the opposite opinion. He said that it was because of Darius that each of them now governed his city as tyrant, and if the power of Darius were destroyed, he himself would not be able to keep ruling Miletus, nor would anyone else be able to rule his own city. And so they did not betray the Persians. They left the bridge intact because they thought it was the best way to preserve their power. Now, just in case we are wondering about the extent of this opportunity that these Greeks had to bring down Persian power, Herodotus reminds us in Book 7, when the Persians are in conclave and reflecting on these events, a man named Artabanus says this to Xerxes. If Histiaeus, the tyrant of Miletus, had conformed to the opinion of the other tyrants, instead of opposing them, that would have been the end of Persian power. So according to Herodotus, the Persians themselves acknowledge how exposed they were. The events we will discuss in this video, dealing with the political betrayal of Ionia, are so perfectly conformed to a discussion of nakedly self-centered motives in the pursuit of power, it is as though history was conducted under the controlled experimentation of an instruction-minded fate. And two men from Miletus demonstrate this for us the best: Histiaeus and Aristagoras. Histiaeus is who we just met, and for his loyalty in maintaining the bridge for Darius, he is given some land in Myrkinos up in Thrace. But a few years later, the Persians considered that Histiaeus was actually far too well situated where he was, and could pose a threat to peace in the region, and so he was invited to Susa to act as an advisor to Darius, and thinking this was a very great opportunity, Histiaeus accepted. So he goes off to Susa, the Persian capital. But his son-in-law and cousin is this guy Aristagoras, who is now in command of Miletus. This is the other person we need to talk about in this video. He also feels no need to favor Greeks over Persians. When some exiles from Naxos arrived at Miletus, this is what occurs to him to do, according to Herodotus. He writes, Aristagoras, thinking that he would obtain the rule over Naxos if the exiles succeeded in returning through his help, spoke with Artaphernes, informing him that although Naxos was not a very large island, it was fair and fertile, contained abundant wealth and slaves. And so the Persians and Ionians launch an attack on Naxos. But Herodotus writes, the Persians besieged the city for 4 months, but then when all the supplies that they had brought had been exhausted, they recognized that they were failing and departed. So now, Aristagoras has given the Persians advice that resulted in total failure and a waste of their manpower and resources. And he knows he only rules Miletus by the will of the Persians, and he has just let them down. And so Herodotus writes, he, as an Aristagoras, also feared that because of the army's lack of success, his absolute rule over Miletus would be taken from him. Plagued with anxiety, he began to plan a revolt. So this is the beginning of the revolt. Meanwhile, Histiaeus is in Susa, also desiring to return to his city, and by a coincidence of fate, he sent a message to Aristagoras tattooed on the head of a slave ordering him to revolt, and Herodotus explains why. Histiaeus had made this move because he resented being detained at Susa and had high hopes that he would be released to go to the coast in the event of a revolt there. Moreover, he thought that unless something to upset the prevailing system was done at Miletus, he would never return to the city again. So Histiaeus doesn't care about Ionian freedom. He wants there to be a revolt so that he's needed there. The decision had nothing to do, in the immediate sense, with Persian oppression of Ionian people. Indeed, in order to induce the people of the city to join him in the revolt, Aristagoras had to promise them political liberty. Herodotus writes, first of all, he claimed he was letting go of his tyranny, and he established isonomy in Miletus so that the Milesians would be willing to join him and support the revolt. Now, the Purvis translation, we have to hope it's true to the tenor of Herodotus. I'm using the Andrea Purvis translation. The use of the word claimed, that Aristagoras claimed he was going to give isonomy to the people of Ionia in the long term. Herodotus might doubt this. It shows us something also about the Milesian people, that they're smart enough to know not to be induced to a revolt, just to be under the absolute rule of one of their own, as a replacement for the absolute rule of a foreign power. And the other thing that is important to mention is that Miletus is actually doing really well. The following lines from Herodotus help us to see what he thinks about the need for this revolt. He writes, after the Ionians had enjoyed a rather brief reprieve from troubles, problems arose again for them from Naxos and Miletus. While the affluence of Miletus, the pride of Ionia, was at its peak, the affluence of Ionia was peaking under Persian rule. There is no immediate practical cause for this rebellion. So these tyrants, Histiaeus and Aristagoras, in inciting this revolt, have not considered that even one citizen of Miletus would be better off for it, but rather want to bring about all this chaos and death just to get a little bit more power. And for this reason, they remind me of Shakespeare's character Macbeth. That play is very much a contemplation of the lure of power. The monologue, just before he kills the Scottish King Duncan, reveals that he is self-aware he has no just purpose or any claim towards anti-tyrannical vengeance, but lusts for the king's power. The quote is, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other. And Herodotus is even clearer about his own thoughts on the foolishness of the Ionian Revolt when he writes, Aristagoras had devised a plan that would not result in a single benefit for the Ionians, but after all, that was not his goal. So the revolt envelops many Greek cities in Asia. We're not going to go through every event because this is not a military channel. But when things aren't going well, Herodotus writes, Aristagoras revealed how weak-spirited he really was, for when he saw the disorder and upheaval in Ionia that he had stirred up, he now realized that it would be impossible for him to get the better of Darius. So in those lines from Herodotus, we see a person in Aristagoras that had no foresight, didn't care what the consequences were, and the moment he is confronted with the negative effects of his own actions, Aristagoras abandons the cause and flees to Thrace, where he is killed besieging a city there, leaving us to discuss the fate of Histiaeus, who's been at the Persian court in Susa. And what he tells Darius, once word comes that there's this revolt in Ionia, he tells him, oh, if only I were there, none of this would have happened, so you might as well send me back. And that's what Darius does. But unfortunately for Histiaeus, once he got to Sardis, which is the local provincial capital, Artaphernes, the governor of the province in which Ionia is located, didn't buy the bogus story he had told Darius, and we can wonder what an obvious, shifty, power-hungry weasel Histiaeus must have been. Herodotus writes, Artaphernes, knowing the full details of the revolt, saw right through his cunning deceit, and Histiaeus, in fear because Artaphernes knew and understood so much, ran away toward the coast as soon as night fell. So with no Persians to help him reclaim Miletus, he's unable to take it. They shut him out of the city, he tries to take it by force, and they repel him, and he has to leave. So the funny thing is that while these two men instigated the revolt, it really continued on without their help, and it engulfed many Greek cities in Asia. And we're not getting into the details, but the end result is horrible for Miletus and for Ionia. Herodotus writes, they, as in the Persians, conquered the city completely and enslaved its people. That's the fate of Miletus. Herodotus continues, the majority of their men were killed by the long-haired Persians, and their women and children became their captive slaves. The sanctuary of Didyma set on fire. And Herodotus also writes, so now there were no Milesians in Miletus. The sack of Miletus was a tragic event, and it was received with real heartbreak in the city of Athens. Miletus had made substantial contributions in many cultural areas, including the creation of the regular grid plan in a city, a symbol of Greek urbanism, according to the architectural historian Roland Martin, assumed to be the creation of Hippodamos of Miletus. And Martin continues to talk about excavations at Miletus, showing the different quarters of the city, gymnasia, a theater bay, more gymnasia, and a logical plan for different functions of the city formulated by the philosophers of the Milesian school. So we can get a sense, just from the layout of this city, that this was a place that emphasized the Greek fusion of the philosophical mind with the beautiful body. We know this not just from the excavations and the male torso that was dug up and which is now on display at the Louvre. The art historian Johann Joachim Winckelmann said this about Ionia. The most beautiful race of Greeks, especially with regard to complexion, must have been that which lived in the Ionian climate, the climate that engendered and inspired Homer. And we know from Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus that man discovered the works of Homer in Ionia and from there brought it back to Greece. Winckelmann continues, this same climate awakened and inspired the first poets. Greek philosophy was reared on this soil. And by Greek philosophy, he means Thales, the first Greek philosopher who elevated that study. This is what was lost because of these two men, Aristagoras and Histiaeus. And Histiaeus isn't done after the fall of Miletus. And because of his actions, the rest of Ionia suffers a similar fate. So we see these lines in Herodotus. Histiaeus of Miletus was seizing Ionian merchant ships that were sailing out of the Pontus, sailed to Chios, and when a body of Chian guards refused to admit him, he gave battle, slaughtered many Chians. From there, Histiaeus moved against Thasos. He seems here like a nationless, piratic element. He must command a force with a mercenary quality to it, seeking to subdue any place and subjugate any people that it can find. But the Persian army reacts to this nonsense, defeats him in battle, captures him, brings him to Sardis, and there he's impaled by the Persian governor. So his antics caused a violent reaction against Ionia. Herodotus writes, they, as in the Persians, picked out the most handsome boys and castrated them, making them eunuchs instead of males with testicles, and they dragged off the most beautiful of the virgins to the king. But the thing is, back when Aristagoras was first planning this revolt, he had gone to Athens, and the Athenians had given him 20 ships and men, and they had contributed to the burning of Sardis in the beginning of the violence. And Darius did not forget this Athenian aid, and had been planning his revenge. And in 490 BC, Herodotus writes, Darius sent generals off, instructing them to enslave Athens, and to bring back the captive slaves into his presence.